This is a fragment of an ancient scroll found in the Cave of Letters in YHWH. It was likely created in the late 1st century BC. The scroll it was originally part of likely contained what we know today as the biblical book of Psalms. These textual fragments are part of a psalm that may have possibly been written as early as the late 11th century BC. Although the book of Psalms was probably not put together until somewhere in the 6th to the 5th centuries BC. What is visible on this scroll fragment is a little bit of one of the most well-known portions of the Bible, the 23rd Psalm. And here we can make out a few words from verse 4. And here is verse 4 as it appears in one of the editions of the King James Version. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. This reading is probably how most people are familiar with this verse. Now, the oldest complete copy of the 23rd Psalm, in its original language that is known to exist today, is found in the Leningrad Codex. And this copy is in excellent condition, especially for being over 1,000 years old. And here is verse 4. We're going to walk through a translation of this verse, as it appears in this manuscript, and we'll do the best we can to try to work out what it was that the person who composed this ancient poem was trying to say, and how it may have been read at the time the Book of Psalms was put together. But before we do that, as always, let's begin with some context. Tehillim, or the Book of Psalms, is a collection of poems gathered from all across the histories of the nations of Judah and Israel. The Book of Psalms, as it appears in our Bibles, was likely compiled somewhere in the 6th to the 5th centuries BC, after the exiles from Judah returned from Babylon. Given that the overarching metaphor of the 23rd Psalm depicts the Israelite God, Yahweh, as a shepherd, an understanding of the life, culture, and practices of ancient shepherds living in the arid wasteland of the Judean foothills would be helpful. It would certainly give the reader of this psalm a more nuanced understanding of what the author meant by things like green pastures and paths of righteousness and still waters. But I'm not going to get into too much of that here. For our purposes, that is to understand verse 4 specifically, there are a few historical cultural things we need to be aware of. The 23rd Psalm begins with the phrase, Mitzmor le David, which attributes this psalm to none other than King David. And there are a couple of reasons why this is relevant. First, it means that this psalm was meant to be read as if King David himself was the poet, regardless of whether or not he was the actual author. It was to be read as if he was the voice speaking, and is also relevant to note that he himself was originally a shepherd. Second, David being the king of Israel means that it is likely that the ancient people who put the Book of Psalms together would have read this as explicitly being about David, but implicitly being about the nation as a whole. This is due to a cultural assumption that seemed to be ubiquitous in the ancient world. That is, the idea that a patriarch, tribal chieftain, elder, warlord, king, or even priest would be thought of as the corporate embodiment of the people they were responsible for. In theological discussions within Christianity, the terms of corporate solidarity or federal headship are used for this idea. There is a distinction between these two terms, but we don't need to get into that here. For our purposes, we need to just realize that in the mind of the ancient people of the Near East, the king was the corporate embodiment of the kingdom, or just simply, so goes the king, so goes the kingdom. Looking at the book of Melachim, we see the history of the relationship of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah to Yahweh can be told with a survey of their kings. This principle extends to the idea of a patriarch's relationship to their household, or even to a deity and their people. In the ancient Near East, a deity was pretty much always conceptually linked to a people, nation, land, tribe, or even just a household. And of course, the simplest example of this principle is the relationship of a shepherd to their flock. And all of these examples can be, and often are, used as metaphors for each other. So each of these can be referred to as a roe, or a shepherd, and each of these can be referred to as a bayit, that is a house or household. So Bayit David, the house of David, can refer not only to David's dynasty, but also his kingdom. When David refers to Yahweh as Roi, my shepherd, it is synonymous with saying that he dwells, Baveth Yahweh, in the household of Yahweh. This metaphorical idea of a king as a shepherd is not only found in the Semitic cultures of the Near East, like the ancient Israelites. The Sumerian culture depicted their kings in shepherd's garb and gave them the title Sipalunga, shepherd king. In Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris is often depicted holding shepherd's tools, which, due to the identification of the pharaoh with Osiris, the pharaohs would often be depicted with the same shepherd's crook and flail. Now, there is another cultural assumption that was part of the ancient world that we need before we can proceed. That is the imagery that ancient Near Eastern cultures used when writing about the concept of death, specifically in the mythological stories of the northwestern Semitic cultures. There we find death personified as Mut. He was a character in their stories about their various deities. Sometimes he's depicted as a warrior, but most of the times he is depicted as a devouring monster, with an insatiable appetite, whose jaws are the very gates to the underworld. He is the master of the underworld, which is a place of darkness and mud. He doesn't seem to have been considered a deity per se. That is, there are no known temples or descriptions of cultic worship being ascribed to him, but he plays an important role in their mythological stories. In this copy of the Baal cycle found at Ugarit, we find this description of Mut. He extends a lip to the earth, a lip to the heavens, he extends a tongue to the stars. He is a giant mouth that consumes all, both humans and gods alike. The religious texts found at Ugarit, like this one, predate the biblical literature, and they are useful when it comes to biblical studies because they give us a window into the cultures and mythology of the Canaanites, or at least a culture very similar to the Canaanites. And the language of Ugarit, being in the same family as Hebrew, shares a lot of grammar and vocabulary with biblical Hebrew. In Hebrew, death is the same word as in Ugaritic, moeth or mot, depending on how you vocalize it. In the Masoretic text, we can see the same word vocalized in both ways. In the Hebrew Bible, death, for the most part, is demythologized, meaning he is not a character in any of the stories, although the concept of death is still personified as a devouring monster. Just compare this text from Ugarit with this passage from Habakkuk. My throat is the throat of a lion in the wasteland. His throat is as wide as Sheol. Like Moeth, he has never enough. Even though both of these passages are in different languages, they both use the same word for throat. That is nephesh, which literally means throat but conveys the idea of appetite, hunger, thirst, or just desire. Just like in Psalm 23, verse 3, we have nafshi yeshovev, which literally means my throat or thirst will repent, meaning I am satisfied, or I am refreshed. This is in reference to being led to the still waters mentioned in verse 2. There is a similar mythological creature with a similar name in Egyptian mythology. Her name is Ammit or Ammut, the devourer of the dead. She is depicted as a mix of a crocodile, hippopotamus, and a lion or leopard, all animals that are just giant mouths that eat. In Isaiah 25:8, the imagery of Moeth as a great devourer is turned back on itself. He will swallow up Moeth forever. That is, Yahweh will conquer death on behalf of his people. A good way for modern readers to think of Moeth, that is, if you, living in the modern Western world, saw this type of imagery, you would intuitively know that it is a depiction or representation of death, even though it is very unlikely that you can find anyone who actually believes death is a skeleton in a robe swinging farm equipment around. In a similar way, in the poetry of ancient Israel and Judah, there would be a personification of death which would invoke the ideas of darkness and a monster whose throat is the entrance to the underworld. What we know is the Book of Psalms is actually divided up into 5 books. The 23rd Psalm is in Book 1. Psalms 3 through 41 are all Psalms of David, which, due to the principle I already laid out, these Psalms would have been read as being about David, with a subtext of them being about the nation. And furthermore, especially in the post-exilic period, they would have been read as messianic, meaning that they were read as describing an ideal future king from the house of David. And therefore they would also describe an ideal future nation, that is faithful to Yahweh and enjoys all the covenant blessings. The 23rd Psalm is made up of 6 verses. As I've already mentioned, verses 1 and 6 is a synonymous parallelism. As is typical of Hebrew poetry, there are some shifts in the poet's voice regarding who is being addressed. In verses 1 through 3, Yahweh is spoken about in the third person, then in verses 4 and 5, he is spoken to in the second person. And then in verse 6, the psalmist returns to speaking about Yahweh in the third person. Now, just forgetting the context of verse 4, I'll read the whole psalm in English. And since this is such a well-known passage, I thought it would be fun to read it from the English translation of 1611, commonly referred to as the Authorized Version. It is what all the various editions and printings of the King James Version are based on. And I'll do my best to try and read it in an early modern English pronunciation. A Psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth me soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest me head with oil. Me cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Gim ki alek begge salamaweth lo ira ra ki ata imadi. Shiv teka umisha anteka hama yenachamuni. Now, let's give ourselves a little space to work. Looking at this first line, we see it has 2 clauses, with the first beginning with the adverb gam, which has a number of different uses, and then we see ki, which is a conjunction that also has a number of different uses. But when we see gam followed by ki, this lets us know that this is likely being used to introduce a concessive clause, meaning that the first clause is describing something that does not prevent the main clause from being true or occurring, even though it would be expected to do so. For example, in the second line of Isaiah 1:15, you have, "Even though you multiply prayers, I will not listen." You see the gam ki construction at the beginning of this subordinate clause, communicating that this is true in spite of this being true. So we can go with a translation of even though that. A lake is a verb. It is a call imperfect first person singular, from the root halak, meaning to walk or to go. So we can render this I will walk. Begay is the preposition in or with, and the construct form of the noun, meaning a valley. So we can go with in a valley of. Salmoeth is a noun, and it appears to be a compound word from sel, meaning darkness, and moeth, meaning death. When one encounters a compound word like this, the initial assumption is that it is a proper noun, either a personal name or a toponym, in which case you would expect to see the use of a deity name, which we do, sort of. As I mentioned earlier, moeth is a personification of death, and moeth does seem to show up in proper names, and it is a word that has very ancient, wide-reaching mythological significance, conjuring up the imagery of death as a devouring monster. Salmoeth is likely metaphorical, simply because this psalm, for the most part, is metaphorical, and it seems fairly common to use the idea of a valley as metaphorical in biblical literature. When we look at how Salmoeth is used throughout the Hebrew Bible, we see it used to convey ideas of literal darkness, and darkness in the sense of unknowing and confusion, like being lost in the dark. But the primary associations with Salmoeth would be the ideas of death and the underworld, with it even being described as a land, and being used as a synonym for Sheol. At the end of Job chapter 10, Job is making the case that due to his suffering, his life is pointless, and he is longing for death. In these few verses, he describes death and he uses just about every word in the Hebrew language for, and related to, the idea of darkness, including using salmoeth twice. Are not my days few? Leave me alone, that I may find a little comfort before I go, never to return, to the land of darkness and salmoeth. To the land of darkness, like the darkness of salmoeth and chaos, where even light is thick darkness. And in Job 38:17 we see salmoeth used synonymously with just moeth in a description of the entrance to the underworld. Have the gates of Moeth been revealed to you? Or have you seen the gates of Salmoeth? And in the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible, the foretold destructions of the nations of Israel and Judah is described as the nation's death, and their promised restoration as God retrieving them from the land of the dead, like in the passage I mentioned earlier about death being the one that is swallowed up. And here in Isaiah chapter 9 verse 1, or verse 2 in English, we have, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, those who dwelt in the land of Salmoeth. On them a light shone." The word Salmoeth is always linked to the idea of death in the underworld and its associated darkness. It would have stirred up imagery of the mythological Moeth, or Molt, the great devouring monster. So then how do we turn this into English? Well, of course, we have no such word in English that would invoke the same ideas that Salmoeth would have. The Septuagint renders this fairly literally as skiathanatu, which is shadow of death, just like the English King James Version, which works, but I don't want to use the word shadow, simply because the word shadow in ancient Hebrew poetry has only positive connotations. It is used metaphorically to convey ideas of protection, provision, and safety. What is going on here is the literal opposite, so perhaps darkness instead of shadow would be appropriate. And since it is a single word in Hebrew, maybe we should communicate that by using a hyphenated death darkness. But this word carries associations that neither of these two English words carry. And since it is a metaphorical place name, I'm tempted to just use a transliteration. But for our purposes here, the hyperliteral rendering of death darkness, I think will be fine. Moving on, lo is a negation. In ira is a verb from the root yare, meaning to fear. It is a call imperfect first person singular, so we can go with I will not fear. Ra is an adjective, although here it is used as a noun. A lot of English translations will go with evil for this word, but the English word evil has some associations with morality, as in good versus evil. Ra isn't necessarily good or evil, morally speaking. In the Bible, it is used to describe the actions of both God and humans. So we will go with the English word harm. It is general enough to cover the meaning of ra without the moral connotations. Ki is a conjunction. In this case, it is indicating causation, so we can go with because. Ata is the second person personal pronoun, you, the antecedent being Yahweh, introduced back in verse 1. Here the psalmist is speaking to Yahweh. Imadi is interesting because every English translation I could find rendered this as with me. This is odd because if you take the Hebrew preposition im, meaning with, and you add the first person pronoun to it, you get immi, with me. But what we have here is imadi, which looks like it's from the root amad, which can mean to stand. Looking at a number of different Hebrew lexicons reveals that there is not a consensus on this. They suggest a variety of roots. But how a word is used is far more useful than etymology when it comes to trying to work out its meaning. Grammatically speaking, this one is a preposition plus a pronoun, and this one is a noun plus a pronoun. This one appears 46 times in the Hebrew Bible, and this one 45 times. By way of example, in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, we see both used in dialogue by the same character, Naomi. In both cases, she is speaking to her two daughter-in-laws. She used imadi to describe their familial relationship, but when they are traveling, she uses immi to describe their physical location relative to her on the road. when we look at all the use cases of these two words in the Hebrew Bible, what we see is similar to what we see here in the book of Ruth. The preposition with the pronoun has a more general meaning and has a wide variety of uses. The noun with the pronoun, imati, is mostly used for a relationship where a responsibility of care or even loyalty is implied. For example, in Psalm 101:6, I will look with favor on the faithful in the land, that they may dwell imadi, with me. And imadi is used by ha-adam, the human, to describe his relationship to ha-isha, the woman, in Genesis 3:12. And perhaps the most useful example is 1 Samuel 22:23. And this is David speaking to the priest Eviathar. King Saul just killed all of his brothers, and David is asking him to join his little band of outlaws. This clause uses the same syntax as our verse in Psalm 23. Here we read, Ki mishmereth ata imadi, because you are with me, will be protected. So David is offering protection to Abiathar if he joins him. So now we are trying to turn this into English. Since this is a noun, and we're trying to be as literal as possible, then we need a noun that conveys this idea of implied relationship, of responsibility, of care, and loyalty. Well, there are a few English nouns that can do this, but they each have a narrow context in which they are used. So I think it's best to go with my companion. Although awkward in English, it is a noun that is at least vaguely close to the intended meaning. The second line starts with two nouns connected with the conjunction and. Also, they both have the second person masculine possessive pronominal suffix. They both are shepherd's tools, and they both can be used as symbols of kingship. The first word is shevet, which is a weapon like a mace, club, or scepter. And the second, mishetneth, is a staff, and can be used figuratively for political support. In fact, this word may be derived from the verb meaning to support. This is the only place in the Hebrew Bible that these two words appear together like this. But when either of them appear elsewhere, they often are in synonymous parallelisms with other words that mean rod, scepter, or staff, and almost always in the context of shepherd's tools expressing figurative ideas of leadership and or kingship, the idea being one who has responsibility for the well-being of others, like a shepherd has for their sheep. Hemah is the third person masculine plural pronoun, they, the antecedent being the two previous nouns. Yenachmuni is a verb. It is a PL imperfect third person masculine plural, and it has the first person pronominal suffix. It is from the root nechem, meaning to have compassion or to show sympathy. In the PL stem, it can mean to comfort or to console. The basic idea is to put one's mind at ease. For example, at the end of the book of Genesis, Jacob dies, and Joseph's brothers are worried that now that their father is gone, and Joseph is basically ruling Egypt, that he would now get his revenge on them for selling him into slavery. But Joseph says, "Do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Then we get the statement, "Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them." Another example would be Psalm 119:52. I meditate on your age-old regulations, O Yahweh. They comfort me. So we can render this will comfort me, or put my mind at ease, in the sense of dispelling anxiety. Now, putting this all together, and putting it into a little bit smoother English, we get a fairly literal translation of, even if I walk in a valley of death darkness, I will not fear harm, because you are my companion, your club and your staff, they put me at ease. Now, returning to a goal I mentioned at the start of this video, what was the author of this psalm trying to say? Well, what we have in these 6 verses of poetry that make up the 23rd Psalm is an idealized depiction of the covenant relationship between Yahweh and David. Thus, in verse 4, we have the psalmist expressing his trust in Yahweh to keep his covenant, specifically the promises of protection from harm, even in the hyperbolic situation of facing the ultimate harm, passing through the jaws of Moeth, that is, into the gates of the underworld. A sentiment that is expressed elsewhere in the book of Psalms. If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. For the Jews living post-exile, when the book of Psalms was put together, This was likely read as being about David, and by extension, the nation. For them, the nation had broken the covenant with Yahweh, and as a result, they passed through the jaws of Moeth, the nation being destroyed by the Babylonian army. Now post-exile, and only a remnant of the nation remaining, being reconciled to Yahweh, and the nation on its way to being reestablished, they would have seen the nation as being retrieved from the land of the dead, the nation being on the receiving end of Yahweh's Tov Wachesed, goodness and covenant loyalty. And this psalm would have also been read as messianic, that is, depicting a future king that would be of the line of David who would fully restore the nation and be the corporate head or embodiment of a faithful people of Yahweh, or rather of the Baveth Yahweh, of the household of Yahweh. Naturally, the traditional Christian way of reading the 23rd Psalm is as messianic, thus being a depiction of Christ. In the New Testament, we see all these messianic titles being applied to Jesus. He is the Son of God, Son of David, Son of Israel, Son of Abraham, and the one Jesus most often used of himself in the Gospels, Son of Man, which in Hebrew is Ben Adam. And of course, we also have Jesus declaring, I am the Good Shepherd. So for the Christian, the faithful king of the line of David we have in Psalm 23 is fulfilled in Jesus. And because he is not just the Son of David, but the Son of Man, he is the federal head or corporate embodiment not just of a restored Davidic kingdom, but of a restored humanity. His death and resurrection rescuing us from the curse of death. Now, in more recent times, well, by that I mean the last few hundred centuries, people have been reading the 23rd Psalm in a more personal way, as emotionally identifying with the psalmist, in using this psalm as a prayer for or celebration of God's provision, protection, and special favor. But given that it is a Davidic psalm, and thus traditionally read as messianic, this does seem a bit narcissistic. It should go without saying, you are not the Messiah. Given its context, you can say, if you are a Christian, because it is about Christ, it is implicitly and indirectly about you. This psalm depicts the faithfulness of God to Christ and Christ to God, with Christ even remaining faithful while being swallowed by death, and God being faithful to resurrect him. So because this psalm is about Messiah, if you are one of Christ's sheep, you get to say, V'shavti baveth Yahweh. I will dwell in the household of Yahweh.